In 1840, Britain went to war with China over a single commodity. Not land, not resources, not power, opium. Inside the holds of British warships anchored off Canton were 40,000 chests of opium. Britain was going to force this drug into a nation that had already said no. The Chinese government had destroyed the smuggled stocks. They had forbidden the import. They had executed dealers. And Britain responded by declaring war. The war was called the Opium War because it was literally fought over the right to sell drugs. Britain won, China lost. And what happened next would poison an entire civilization for a century. But the story doesn't start in 1840. It starts 4,000 years earlier, in a time when this plant was sacred. Around 3,400 BCE, in the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, farmers discovered a flower, the opium poppy. They learned to scratch the seed pod, and a dark resin would ooze out. The Sumerians called it Hull Gil, the joy plant, and they were right about what it did. They just didn't know how catastrophic it would become. The plant itself is remarkable. Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy produces alkaloids in its seed pod, morphine, codeine, thebaine. These aren't just chemicals. They're pain erasers, consciousness shifters. When you're in agony, when nothing else works, opium stops the suffering. It stops it completely. For someone dying from a wound, or in the grip of childbirth pain, opium was not a luxury. It was salvation. The ancient Greeks understood this. Hippocrates documented the medical use of opium for severe pain. He wrote about it, prescribed it, taught it to other physicians. Theophrastus, the great naturalist, described it as essential medicine. Galen, the Roman physician, prescribed opium so widely and so successfully that his reputation was built on this single plant. For thousands of years, across every major civilization, Greek, Roman, Persian, Arab, opium was precious because it worked. Only the wealthy could afford it. Only the seriously injured or desperately ill received it, and it was guarded by physicians who understood its power and feared its abuse. But something shifted around 700 CE. Islamic physicians didn't just use opium for medicine, they studied it. The Baghdad House of Wisdom, founded in 830, became the center of pharmaceutical knowledge in the world. Al-Biruni, the Persian polymath, documented opium in his masterwork on pharmacology. Al-Razi, another Persian genius, went further. He documented something doctors had whispered about for centuries: addiction, tolerance, withdrawal. He recognized that continued use required higher doses, that stopping caused physical pain, that the body adapted to the drug and demanded it. He saw this clearly in the 9th century, and he named it. Slowly, over centuries, opium's purpose changed. From medicine, it became ritual. From ritual, it became luxury. By the 1400s, opium use had embedded itself in the courts of the Ottoman Empire and Persian nobility. It became a status symbol. The wealthy displayed their opium collections. They refined techniques for smoking it. They made it a hospitality ritual. Serving opium to guests was a sign of respect and power. The Ottoman Sultan's palace maintained official opium suppliers. This wasn't aberration. This was civilization adopting a drug and calling it culture. By 1600, opium was moving through the world's trade routes like blood through veins. Venetian merchants traded it as a luxury good. Portuguese traders brought it to India. By 1700, opium was the third most valuable commodity in all of Asian trade. Only silk and spices ranked higher. Global opium production had reached 200 to 300 metric tons annually, and Europe was beginning to notice. Portuguese traders introduced opium to European markets in the 1600s. It became fashionable among the wealthy. Laudanum opium, dissolved in alcohol, was legally prescribed by doctors and sold openly in pharmacies. By 1700, opium consumption among European elites was common, and European merchants began to realize something crucial. Opium created demand that never stopped. Users always came back. The addiction was profitable, and it could be exploited. The British East India Company, chartered in 1600, had already established itself as the dominant trader in Asia. But they had a problem. China wanted almost nothing Britain produced. Chinese textiles were superior. Chinese pottery was superior. Chinese silk was superior. The only thing China wanted from Britain was silver, and Britain was hemorrhaging silver to pay for Chinese goods. The trade imbalance was crippling. It was unsustainable, and it was destroying Britain's economy. Then company officials realized India was rich with opium. India was their territory. Opium was addictive. And if they could get China to accept opium as payment, they could reverse the flow of silver. They could break China's isolation. They could crack open the closed market. It would take decades. It would require systematic strategy. But it was possible. In 1773, the British East India Company declared opium a government monopoly in India. They confiscated all independent opium production. They standardized it. They controlled the supply completely. Indian farmers were forced to grow opium instead of food. Indian regional rulers were forced to cede their opium trading rights to Britain. Production exploded. By 1800, Bengal was producing over 3,000 metric tons annually, a 15-fold increase in 30 years. Opium represented 10% of the entire East India Company's profit margin, and profits meant power. But China was still closed. The Chinese government, the Qing dynasty, had restricted all foreign trade to a single port, Canton. And in 1729, the emperor had issued an edict recognizing what Britain already knew: opium was a poison. The punishment for selling opium was death. China had seen the future and rejected it. This didn't stop Britain. Starting in the 1770s, British merchants began systematically smuggling opium into China, knowing it was illegal, knowing the penalty was execution. They did it anyway because the profit was immense. By 1800, an estimated 4,500 chests entered China illegally every year. By 1820, it was 6,000 chests. By 1839, it was 40,000 chests annually, nearly 2,800 metric tons of pure opium flowing into China against the explicit wishes of the Chinese government. And it was working. The addiction was spreading. By 1830, somewhere between 5 and 10 million Chinese were opium users out of a population of 450 million. The user base was doubling every 15 to 20 years, despite the government's prohibition. Opium dens had emerged in every major city. Theft was rising, social chaos was visible, families were collapsing. And Britain knew exactly what was happening. A company memo from 1,793 states: opium consumption in China increases daily. If the Chinese government cannot stop it, the addiction will be nearly universal within decades. A British merchant named James Matheson wrote in 1824, "We are in the business of ensuring the Chinese develop an ever-expanding appetite for our product. These weren't accidental consequences. This was deliberate strategy." By 1839, the Chinese emperor had had enough. He appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner for opium suppression. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton and immediately seized every opium chest he could find. From June 3rd to the 25th of June 1839, his officials publicly burned 20,286 chests of opium. Nearly 1,400 metric tons burned in front of the city. Lin sent a letter to Queen Victoria. He wrote, "We have heard that in your own country opium is prohibited, yet merchants from your country bring opium to China and cause our people to be addicted to this poison. How can this be reconciled with justice?" The letter never reached Victoria. British merchants demanded military protection, and Britain responded not with negotiation, not with apology, not with acceptance of China's boundaries. Britain responded with war. In June 1840, the British Navy began bombarding Chinese ports. China had 200,000 soldiers, but China had no navy. Britain had 16 warships and 4,000 soldiers. The Chinese military was hopelessly outmatched. Within 2 years, it was over. China lost. And in 1842, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking. The terms were explicit. China would pay Britain 21 million silver dollars in war reparations. China would cede Hong Kong to Britain permanently. China would open 5 major ports to British trade. And most importantly, China would legalize opium importation. The drug that the Chinese government had fought to exclude, the poison that officials had warned would destroy the nation, was now legal, taxed, legitimized. After legalization, opium imports accelerated exponentially. From 40,000 chests annually, imports climbed to 80,000 chests by 1860. By 1880, 100,000 chests annually, 7,000 metric tons. By 1900, opium addiction had reached 27% of China's adult male population. 120 million people. 1 in 4 men in the nation was addicted to opium, and it destroyed everything. Soldiers who were addicted couldn't fight effectively. Officials who were addicted couldn't govern. Farmers who were addicted couldn't harvest crops. Entire families were hollowed out. Men spent their entire wages on opium. Children were introduced to addiction by their parents. Women were deliberately hooked by merchants as a form of social control. A Chinese imperial edict from 1,880 states, the opium scourge has penetrated every layer of society. Soldiers cannot fight, officials cannot govern, farmers cannot harvest. Our nation's capacity to function is collapsing. A missionary report from 1,890 documents. We have observed mothers selling their children to buy opium. Addiction has erased all bonds of family and morality. The opium withdrawal is severe. Body pain, psychological distress, insomnia. Once addicted, users require constant supply. Addiction reinforces in weeks. And tolerance builds constantly. Doses must escalate to achieve the same effect. This wasn't addiction as a character flaw. This was addiction as a biological trap. And Britain had deliberately set the trap. Britain wasn't finished. When China attempted to reassert control over opium in 1856, Britain and France declared war again. The Second Opium War was even more brutal. Britain and France looted and burned the Summer Palace. Beijing was occupied and humiliated. An estimated 30,000 Chinese died. The Treaty of Tianjin reinforced opium legalization, forced more ports to open, and demanded additional reparations. The message was clear. China would remain addicted, and Britain would profit from the addiction indefinitely. British officials recognized what they were doing. It wasn't just commerce. A government memo from the 1870s states, "The opium trade serves our strategic interests. An addicted nation is a controllable nation." This was weaponized addiction. This was deliberate destruction of a civilization's capacity to resist. This was empire building through chemical enslavement. But the monopoly didn't last forever. In 1874, a chemist named C.R. Alderwright created diacetyl morphine from morphine. Heroin could be produced synthetically, no longer dependent on Indian opium poppies. By the 1890s, pharmaceutical companies were mass-producing synthetic opioids. Bayer Pharmaceuticals commercialized heroin in 1895 and marketed it as a non-addictive morphine substitute. Their advertisements from 1,900 state, "Heroin, the sedative for coughs. It is not habit-forming." They were lying, but the lie was effective, and the monopoly was broken. By the early 1900s, the negative health consequences of opium addiction had become undeniable. Medical doctors published research on addiction as a disease, not a moral failing. Public health movements demanded prohibition. In 1906, the United States passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, requiring labeling of medicines containing opiates. In 1912, nations signed the International Opium Convention, the first international drug control treaty. By the 1920s, most Western nations restricted opium and morphine to medical use only. The drug that had fueled empires was now illegal, but prohibition came too late for China. By the time the West criminalized opium, China had internalized 100 years of addiction. The damage was permanent. The economic transfer was complete. The wealth had flowed from China to Britain, the social structure had been destroyed, and even after legalized prohibition in 1906, addiction persisted in China for decades. But here's what's remarkable. Here's what should make you reconsider everything you think you know about history, about progress, about the difference between barbarism and civilization. Today, the opioid is legal. Today, it's everywhere. Today, it's called medicine. By 2020, the United States had 282 million opioid prescriptions filled, nearly one prescription per person. In 2023, 49 million opioid prescriptions were written annually. The United States consumes 80% of the global opioid supply, and we are 5% of the global population. Global opioid production is now around 1,000 metric tons annually, and global opioid deaths are around 650,000 every year. In the 1990s, pharmaceutical companies discovered what Britain had discovered 150 years earlier. Addiction was profitable. OxyContin was marketed as a safe, non-addictive painkiller. Purdue Pharma spent millions ensuring doctors prescribed it widely. Their marketing materials from 1,996 state. OxyContin is appropriate to prescribe to patients from infants to the elderly. Infants. Internal Purdue memos discussed users as junkies, slackers, and hillbilly heroin users, while their marketing emphasized safety and responsibility. By 2020, 2.1 million American citizens were addicted to prescription opioids. In 2022, 106,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. Most of those deaths involved opioids. The mechanism was identical to the Opium Wars. A substance that creates addiction is deliberately marketed to expand markets and extract profit. The only difference is that it was now legal, regulated, performed by corporations instead of empires. And here's the final parallel. Today, China manufactures fentanyl. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, is produced in China and shipped globally. It's mixed into heroin, it's mixed into cocaine, it's pressed into counterfeit pills. Users don't know they're taking it. Fentanyl seizures in the United States increased from 1 kilogram in 2013 to 60 metric tons annually by 2022. Fentanyl is now the leading cause of overdose death in America. Over 70,000 deaths in 2022 alone. So Britain forced opium onto China for 100 years. And now China manufactures the synthetic version that's killing Americans. The circle hasn't closed, it's spiraling. Opium did not stop mattering when it became less profitable. What changed was not the drug. What changed was the law. When opium was precious, empires fought wars for it. When opium became common, we called it pharmaceutical progress. But the mechanism is unchanged. A substance that addles the mind, destroys families, and kills thousands is marketed and distributed for profit. We tell ourselves stories about progress, that empires forcing drugs on unwilling populations was barbarism, the past, something we've evolved beyond. But today, we have prescription opioids. We have fentanyl epidemics. We have the highest per capita opioid consumption on Earth. The only difference between Britain forcing opium onto China and Purdue Pharma over-prescribing OxyContin is that one was called imperialism and the other is called medicine. We didn't stop the opium wars, we just made them legal, privatized them, told ourselves they were progress, and the cycle continues. The same addiction, the same profit motive, the same destruction, just a different label. And that is what opium reveals about civilization. Our capacity to rationalize harm when profit is involved. Our willingness to ignore addiction if it's legal. Our ability to look directly at 100 years of history and repeat it anyway. Because the incentives haven't changed. Only the laws have.